Is Zoom church good enough for the average Christian? Join me in this episode where I talk to a psychologist and a theologian who teamed up to write a book arguing that we are actually made to be together and that we can actually learn from developmental psychology and the best of theology, that we're made to attend to God and to learn about Him and to even praise Him together. Like, that's actually what humans are. Fascinating discussion. We're going to learn about what babies can and can't do and why it should instruct us on how we think about being people who look together at the things God has set in front of us and say, do you see what I see? Stay tuned.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
How did you get interested in this issue of worship and individual worship and corporate worship and what's going on when we worship? Why is that so intriguing to you personally?
Yeah, I guess there's a few different routes in for me. I did my PhD on the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. So my PhD is on Christian spirituality and faith. And I thought quite a bit about spiritual practice in that. If anybody's read Kierkegaard, you'll know that he doesn't really have any space for ecclesiology. His whole theology is about trying to kind of tear the individual away from the kind of nominal faith of the church.
Right. The church is kind of a problem.
Yeah, the church is the problem for Kierkegaard. And he thinks that we need to kind of re-evangelize the church. And I found that really compelling, but I also was really dissatisfied with the lack of a kind of ecclesial theology there. At the same time, I'm also I was exploring ordination in the church. I'm ordained in the Church of England, and so some of it's a kind of personal story of how do you marry up that, like, the stuff that you're thinking and writing about with the kind of more vocational side of yourself. So really, the pull was to try and make sense of what the church is for and why it is that we gather. Even personally, I think some of the motivation for me is a lot of the friends that I was close to in my young 20s, like at uni, that were kind of solid in their faith, went to church, all stopped going to church when they left uni, and quite a few of my friends from uni have lost their faith or they're kind of not engaged in church. And so I'm kind of intrigued by that question of why we bother going to church at all. That I feel like that's quite a live question for me on a lot of fronts. So I think there are lots of reasons why I'm interested by the question.
Yeah, and especially after post-COVID, everybody has had to kind of deal with this question, like what is church actually for and what does it do?
Yeah.
To us?
Yeah.
And Gideon, you're a psychologist by training, and there's been a long train coming in psychology that is mostly involved in mental activity or thinking of people as kind of mental creatures that then act out of deliberation. That seems to have changed lately. So I assume, I say lately, I mean like the last 40 or 50 years maybe. So how, maybe you can talk about how do psychologists see the role of the body? And I mean the body in two senses, like the individual body that I grow into, and then the corporate body as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree there has been in some senses, like a growing emphasis on, trying to understand the role of the body in cognition. So there are, most explicitly in the sort of embodied cognition movement, also it's kind of a cluster of sort of views. I guess you could kind of trace back the origins of that to sort of like pragmatist approaches to the philosophy of mind. So that its sort of seeds have always been floating around. There's a sort of interesting sort of the history of psychology in terms of, the effect of the so-called cognitive revolution, and how that sort of made this like very cognition as an activity of the brain and something happening in your head become the sort of dominant way of approaching psychology. And I think that's probably is largely the orthodoxy, but increasingly there are sort of alternative ways of approaching that, where bodily activity is taken more seriously as potentially part of the cognitive process in some sense. And likewise, as you alluded to, this shift towards not thinking about individual minds in isolation, but the ways that there are these interdependent relationships between agents and minds and bodies, that's taking the individual as the fundamental unit of study, can make understanding processes like social interaction quite difficult. Whereas taking, for example, a pair of agents interacting as your fundamental unit can sort of reveal insights where you just can't seem to get at that by looking at one person. They sort of seem to be sort of inherently relational phenomena, which it doesn't stop you looking at the activity of individuals, and part of it depends on the kind of question you're wanting to address. Even if that may be the case about social interaction, for example, in my field, sometimes it's useful to know how is this individual infant doing, how is their development progressing, and you want to be able to answer that on an individual basis. But it's also understood that you need to look at how they are in these interdependent interactions with their caregivers, for example, if you want to understand their language development, to take one specific example.
Yeah, I guess it's a little more obvious in the field of developmental psychology, which is what you do. Like that the mother and father are going to be pretty direct, the social
exactly, yeah,
pretty thick there, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, because you in this book, Why We Gather, did I get the name right? I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, it's a catchy title. Even I remembered. I can't remember the name of my own books with children. But Why We Gather is considering like how those boundaries between individuals kind of operate, and how do people worship together? Why do they worship together, and why is that important? Before we get into the content of that book, I'm Josh, because you're in what we call the analytic theology tradition, which tends to be much more, again, focused on the cognitive, how people think about things, even abstract ideas very heavily. But I'm seeing a subtle shift as well. I feel like a lot more analytic philosophers and analytic theologians are much more interested in the body as well. Why did you go that route? I guess you could have easily worked in analytic theology and kind of gone more just the abstract ideas route. Why was this so important to you?
Yeah, my honest answer is I find that the kind of abstract ideas route a little boring.
There's a lot of truth in that.
There's a stereotype of analytic theology which it's kind of stale and lifeless and cares about technical distinctions, which is not entirely untrue.
Right.
But I've trained I trained in an analytic philosophy department. I worked with a very analytic supervisor, but have never been particularly interested in carving out the kind of specifics of doctrine. It's just never appealed to me. I think maybe that's just partly how I'm wired, the things I'm interested in. But I found the tools of analytic philosophy really fruitful for thinking about practice and the spiritual life and liturgy and worship and things that I think typically analytic thinkers haven't thought all that much about. I found them to be really fruitful conversation partners. So, and I think there's a lot, like you say, there are a lot of people trying to do some of this work that's a little more affective. The conversation has shifted a lot in the past 10 years.
Yeah. And that's a good summary of my little bit of training in analytic philosophy. I always say the tools are very helpful. The discussions I'm not always as interested in, the tightly wrapped discussions. Okay, so you guys got together, a psychologist, and you crossed the yard in St. Andrews because there's like just a little bit of a garden between the divinity school and the psychology department. And how did you guys come up with the idea to write together? Because I've co-written things before that can go really sideways on you if you don't work as a team. So how did you guys decide that this needed to be written by you two?
Yeah, we didn't really. I don't think we really planned it. We certainly didn't plan to write a book together. We effectively we started out by having a coffee together because Gideon had heard that I'd just given some paper which talked about joint attention. And I'll let Gideon talk about joint attention because it's kind of his thing. But he'd heard I was interested in this kind of psychology of joint attention. And so we got set up on some kind of blind academic date, if that's a thing, and got talking about things that we were interested in. We're both Christians, both trying to think together about how our respective disciplines can kind of feed into one another. And we thought, it would be fun to try writing something together. So we just had a go at writing something on prayer. And actually found that we worked really well together. I think sometimes people have this idea that interdisciplinary work is this really neatly divided up thing where you get like the theology here, the psychology here, and each part is written by a different discipline. But actually, we found that we were able to just kind of quite naturally edit the same document and kind of feed our ideas together a little more organically than that. So it felt like a really fruitful connection. We got a paper published, which that helps, doesn't it? When you get that kind of instant feedback that somebody thinks this is worth publishing. And then it kind of just spiraled from there, and we kept getting little pots of grant funding to do various things, and the relationships just kind of grown from there, I think.
Yeah, grant funding is good because it signals that other people find this interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
pass some hurdles. So maybe, Gideon, you can begin by just explaining to us in as simple of terms as possible, what is joint attention, and maybe even why it's important for thinking about things happening in the church. But we'll start with, what is joint attention?
Yeah. So I'll give an example, which I like to give, which is you're standing in the train station, you're looking up at the timetable, and there's a person stood next to you who's also looking at the train times. Actually, this was Josh and I last night, funny enough, looking at our delayed train. But you could stand next to somebody and be looking at the same feature of the world, or attending to the same feature of the world. But it doesn't seem to be joint necessarily if you're just, coincidentally happening to be looking at the same thing. But if you were to sort of turn to the person next to you and sort of sigh or raise your eyebrows and maybe might make eye contact or something like that, something seems to have changed about the experience. It seems to have become, in some sense, joint. It's no longer something that's happening in parallel or just simultaneously, but in some sense, it's something you're doing together. And I think people who are interested in joint attention are really interested in how do we understand this sort of sense of togetherness that seems to be present in the latter sort of case and not in these sort of parallel or simultaneous sorts of cases. And so joint attention, it gets used to refer to, it has slightly different senses. So sometimes it's just used to refer to an ability that, say, humans have, or that infant humans develop. But also it kind of describes that situation in which, two or maybe more agents are attending to some part of the world and they're sort of mutually aware or doing it together in some sense. So as I say, trying to understand what constitutes that togetherness is sort of our interest.
So you work with children in research. So at what age are humans typically able to, I don't even know if realize is the right word, but to...
you could say participate in maybe, or. So I mean, the canonical sort of age is sort of end of the first year. I've actually worked with infants sort of 6 months to 10 months, and we found that some babies as young as 6 months can seem to engage in sort of very basic forms of initiating joint attention to the world around them. So it could be pretty early in development. It sort of grows and gets elaborated over the course of development. So at very young ages, at sort of 6 months, it can be something as simple as, they'll look at something interesting, they'll smile and vocalize and look to their caregiver, and then they'll have this sort of shared moment just based on those very simple behaviors. Then you see sort of gesturing, pointing gestures, and then language use. So language as a means of referring to parts of the world and establishing joint attention to different parts of the world. And then as you get towards sort of more abstract concepts, some people use joint attention to describe what's going on in like linguistic communication as well.
And so this is, to put it most basically, this is when children are able to kind of look at a loved one and say, hey, do you see that? Or like, are you seeing what I'm seeing?
Yeah. That's a nice summary. I mean, we often talk about this transition when you have a maybe really tiny baby, like a 2-month-old baby. They started to smile at you, and you get this sort of face-to-face feedback, maybe vocal feedback as well. And it's communicative in some sense. It's engaged. It's joint in some sense, but there's no sort of referent there. It's not about the world around them, and that sort of transition that occurs during the first year is that sort of including of, did you see that maybe, or what is that perhaps, or can I have that even in some cases? So, yeah.
So it seems that this developmental skill, and we talked about this before, that infants have like all these sets of skills that kind of rise and drop off as they know. I assume that's what's going on. But this one seems to grow, and it also seems to be kind of the foundation of knowing the world as well. So I imagine that when you talk about gathering in corporate worship, that there's probably going to be some aspect of how do we better know the world, know each other, know God as well.
Yeah, it sort of features quite prominently in developmental theories that sort of try and understand how, we begin in this sort of heavily scaffolded environment where caregivers and others sort of introduce us to aspects of the world or help us learn about the world around us, and continues to play a role, as we share experiences of the world with others. They continue, be a massive part of the human experience, a massive part of how we learn new information about the world. Sort of influences us effectively as well when we gather together and have these sort of shared joint experiences together. So it's both a sort of fundamental developmental skill, but one that sort of, as I say, sort of elaborates and continues to play a role sort of across the lifespan.
Is it also, therefore, something that can, for lack of a better word, like atrophy, die off without use, or can we become numb to the skill if we isolate ourselves and get super narcissistic, I guess, in the worst case?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess, I mean, yeah, it's, I guess, the ability to communicate and the ability to, I guess one of the features that comes with experience is perhaps we can do it in more subtle ways. And I guess particularly with people we know quite well, if, for example, like a life partner, you might be able to share quite a rich shared experience just with a single sort of well-timed raise of the eyebrows. You've got a sort of shared history that you can start to draw on, this sort of maybe background knowledge. And I suppose, we talked about COVID. Perhaps we had that sort of sense of like social interactions feeling a bit more stilted when you spent a lot of time in lockdown, and maybe you kind of having to regrow that shared foundation of background knowledge or background experience that. So if you sort of find yourself outside of communities, outside of having that experience of social interaction, you probably would find that your joint attention experiences do become that much more stilted or require that much more effort.
It's funny you said a well-timed raise of the eyebrow. I feel like that is the British sense of humor in general. Like,
yes,
it sounds just like a
yes, and a lot can be packed into it, right? Yeah.
Josh, so you are a priest in the Church of England. I'm a reverend in the Presbyterian Church. Are you ordained, Gideon?
No, I'm not.
I mean, you can stay out of this conversation.
Yeah. I just play. Yeah.
Josh, I wonder, to you in the Church of England liturgy, at what points in the liturgy do you feel like are really high points of joint attention versus like, because you obviously would have like introspective moments, right?
There's it's interesting, isn't it? There's sometimes bits that I would like to be more points of joint attention. For instance, in the Church of England liturgy, we always have a prayer called a collect, which is it's usually the same prayer every week. It changes sometimes. It's the same prayer every day for a week. Right. That usually collects, they come in different places in the service. One of the places they sometimes come is after a confession, and the theologically what it signifies is that we've come here as individuals, we've gathered to worship, we've confessed our sins, and now our prayers have been gathered together by the Holy Spirit that we might come to worship to listen to the word, to gather around the table. So there's something really nice. There are various points at the liturgy which I think really hit those points, that actually we've been collected as a group of individuals to worship, not just as church is not just about me and Jesus. That's it's not a place to come to further my relationship with God. It's a place where we're collected as God's people to participate in God's worship. Sadly, I don't think collects really do that, like in a kind of practical sense. I'm not sure they actually do that job, because I think most people don't really think about what they're doing. They're just like, how many clauses were in that sentence? Was often what I think when I hear a collect.
That is specifically book a church order.
Yeah.
Church order, common book of prayer.
Yeah. For me, one of the high points of gathering is, and one of the things I really love about being ordained, is when I'm presiding at communion or the Eucharist. And one of a good example is when I read the words of institution, which I'll basically talk about on the night Jesus was betrayed. He took bread with his friends and said, "Take, eat, this is my body given for you." One of the things I always try and do, maybe I've thought too much about the kind of psychology of what's going on here. I always try and make eye contact with people when I and look around the room and say, "Take, eat, this is my body broken for you." And there's something profoundly powerful about that moment, as someone that's leading worship, that all the eyes in the room are on what's happening in this retelling of the story, and on these simple gifts of bread and wine. And it is a really powerful moment, because it's such a intensely focused moment. I mean, of course, you've got people that don't engage with it, and people that kind of might be doing something different entirely. But it does feel like a really significant moment of looking together, of gathering together. So for me, I think that's the kind of focal point of gathering. That's the very Anglican thing to say, isn't it? It's like,
sorry. And now we can get to your real answer. No, it's true. And there, even when you preach, I've always had this kind of internal dialogue of, when I talk about how do we apply what we've heard, should it be a we or a you? Because we is more comfortable, you is more pointed, right?
Yeah.
It just dawned on me while you were speaking that the first activity of humankind in the creation is an activity of joint attention. That it's God who says it's not good for him to be alone, right? So here's what joint, but the alone. But then he sets about presenting him animals that he's formed, and God is also waiting to see what he's going to name them, right? So it's like, what's going on here? And so there's this kind of argument in Genesis 2 that this is what we are as creatures, and that finally him recognizing his erkenegdo, his fit mate. I don't know what you call it. Fit mate sounds different in British English than it does. His strong ally. That's what one friend did. His strong ally. This is the high point. I could ask the persnickety question here, is something like, does it matter if we miss this point of joint attention? Like, do we need to know this, or is this just kind of like theological addenda?
Yeah. Somebody should write a book about this, right? It sounds like Genesis and joint attention. It sounds like a project for you, Dru. Are you asking, does it matter if we miss what's going on in the Genesis account? Is that?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me retract. That was a sidebar in my own. This is my AD kicking in. I think I wonder if it matters if people don't attend to the issues of joint attention and worship. Like, what's lost when they let this aspect of worship slip away?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned from Gideon and from engaging with psychology and through this project is that jointness, or did we use sharedness or jointness in the book? We changed our minds so many times.
Yeah, I think we land on jointness in the end. Just
jointness. So we talk about this concept of jointness in the book, which is a much thicker, a much broader concept than joint attention. And I think it's really useful for thinking about worship. It's really changed the way I participate in worship, just thinking about this. So Gideon used that example of looking up at the train board, but there are actually different ways in which our experiences of the world are joint or shared with others. One of the examples we use in the book is you get in the back of a taxi and you might kind of have a conversation with the taxi driver. But then probably for the rest of the journey, you don't really attend to what they're attending to. You kind of like stare down at your phone or read your book, but there's a sense in which like that experience, even though you're not really paying attention to the taxi driver, there's a sense in which that experience is joint. Like it's kind of it has some kind of boundaries around it. And there are kind of thicker notions of jointness that happen, like when the World Cup happens. I mean, every other country in the world cares about the World Cup other than you guys, right?
When we start dominating, then we'll care.
But when the World Cup happens, there's almost like a kind of cultural sense of jointness that happens. That like, I know that if I just text one of my friends saying, that was incredible, there doesn't need to be any other reference point. They know that what I mean is that England have just scored, and because I know that they're watching, and they know that I know that they're watching, and so actually there is a sense in which like there's a kind of cultural jointness there that that's kind of much thicker than just this really intense experience that we're having, where we're trying to make eye contact and talk to each other, and that those kind of thicker concepts I think are really helpful for thinking about worship, because when you gather to worship, there's a range of different ways of joining in what's happening, and actually some of this we really liked some of what you have to say about this, Dru, and some of the ways you think about it in Hebrew rituals, that there's not really one way of participating in a ritual. And actually I think that's important for jointness. There's not one way of participating in this sense of jointness. So the little kid who screams all the way through the service still in some way participates in what it means for that ritual, that liturgy, to be joint. And I found that a really fruitful way of broadening my concept of jointness. I think sometimes we've got young kids, and we try and help them to participate in church.
Yeah.
But if you've ever tried to take a young child to church, you know that they're not gonna join in with the songs, are they? Or it's not much fun.
Telling them to do otherwise, right?
Yeah,
and period is telling them.
And I think there's a kind of approach which says no, they have to pay attention in a way that an adult pays attention for them to participate. But actually, some of these thicker notions I think are really helpful for us to complexify what's going on in that situation. Perhaps even if they're just sitting and colouring at the back, there's a way in which they participate in what's happening. Gideon, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, I guess partly it's sort of if we're honest about how adults participate, it might be more. Sometimes it's more similar to that than we might think. That actually, there are times when adult participants are maybe not fully engaged, or maybe emotionally not really with it in the right sort of way. And yeah, it sort of allows us to talk about how you might participate even on those days or those times where you're not sort of fully involved as you might wish to be, or not as attentive as you might wish to be.
What you said about football during the World Cup, I have several times, just in the last few months, had somebody I don't talk to very often, but I know very well, someone I can catch up with very easily, who will just text me like, the cup and the bread were really good for me today, or something like that. So like, I know it's Sunday, I know where they were, and so that, again, we even thousands of miles apart, we're still kind of jointly attending, because we know that we're Christians and we participate in these rituals. I remember in seminary we had pastoral theology classes, and we had to discuss, like, should you bring the sacrament to people in the hospital, right? Or should you just make them hold off with the expectation, that they're going to return? Or should, if I'm by myself on a camping trip, should I take communion? I'm wondering how much do you think joint attention is baked in theologically to what the people of God do?
Yeah, I think it goes all the way down, and that's why I think it's such a fruitful concept. There's this idea that you get in Evelyn Underhill's work on liturgy, where she talks about the fact that there's no such thing as solitary worship.
Mm.
That even when you're in your room praying to God, you're doing so as a member of the divine society of God's people. That the Holy Spirit knits your prayers into the work of God's people. And so I think there is a sense in which, like, theologically, we want to say that worship is personal, but it's never private. Like, you can be on your own, but it's always, in this sicker sense, participating in something bigger than just you and God. But I also think that then shifts some of those kind of normative questions about how we practice. I mean, the way I think about, we don't want to get into that too meaty a conversation about the kind
we
of.
don't have to make any, like, hard.
But I do think one of the concepts we talk about in the Church of England, I'm sure other traditions talk about, is if we're visiting the sick, we do something called communion by extension, or so basically this is the meal. The meal is celebrated with the community, and then effectively the leftovers from the meal are taken to those that can't come to the dinner. And I actually think pastorally there's something quite significant about that, because you're not saying, like, I'm going to go and then celebrate communion with this person, but you're saying you can't come to the family meal, but you're part of it. You're still part of it. It's a bit like if you like your grandma can't get to Christmas dinner, and you say, we saved you some of the turkey and potatoes, and we'll take it over to the hospital so grandma can still join in.
Yeah.
So I think there's some dynamics there that are quite important to emphasize theologically about participating in a community.
Yeah, and just thinking in the ritual thinking across the biblical literature, they could have given prescriptions for all of these things, but they leave things in this kind of very carefully innovative space where, again, you have to think about what would be a natural extension of what's going on here versus what transgresses. And people can argue about this ad nauseum. But so I guess going back to the issue of jointedness, so you have two issues then going on, that kind of jointness and then joint attention. So jointness is the maybe the phenomenological field. The attention is what you actually is going on. I don't know. Or would you not divide them up that way, or does it matter?
I guess maybe some think of, like, joint attention as a concept really began as a way of trying to understand these very early interactions between infants and their caregivers. So as soon as you start talking about what's happening with adults, for example, we've already moved away from that, but it does seem to be something akin to that, or it seems to be related to those very early experiences. So those very early experiences are very much sort of embodied, active, with a co-present other. But it seems restrictive to say that that's the only scenario in which we can talk about a situation being joint. And I guess that's why we bring in this idea of jointness, because there seems to be this full sort of spectrum or variety of cases. Josh has already outlined some of these, and it's kind of helpful to be able to say, it still seems the case that these embodied, co-present interactions where you have, bodily signals, gaze direction, maybe even physical contacts, speech, and so on, they retain a certain kind of potency or importance as part of human shared experience. But to try and restrict everything to that, I mean, even if you think about, a gathered congregation, how many people are you actually making eye contact with?
Right.
Those moments might have a certain potency, as Josh has described, but realistically, that seems a high bar. If we're going to say that those are the only cases that are joint, then that seems like a high bar to reach. And so being able to talk about this broader sort of sense of jointness and the sort of more varied ways that you can cultivate that, whether with, gathered with others, or, it allows us to think about, in what sense is an online church service joint? I mean, It seems like it is. It's more than just simply watching a YouTube video back of a church service, but it's clearly not the same as being gathered in person. I think the idea of jointness and the idea of these varieties of jointness and the various factors that contribute to them, even the layout of a space, if you think about aspects of architecture, where the pulpit is located, where the Eucharistic table is located, the shape of the building itself, all these things are sort of helping us build a sense of jointness towards different features of our environment. And so it just provides us with a set of tools to talk about that. And then, then you can get into these normative considerations in terms of, okay, there's a bit of a trade-off. We give the example in the book of, in what sense are the children involved? Where do you have the children? Do they sit in the pews with the adults? Do they go outside for a portion of the service? Do you have something combined with it in and out? And there's not really how you approach that question. You will achieve different ends depending on how you approach that kind of issue. And that's kind of at the discretion of different communities to try and make those trade-offs and say, well, if we have children there throughout, they get bored and restless, but it might feel like they're more part of things in some sense, versus if we have them outside, they're less distractible, but then do they really feel part of the gathered community? So again, we don't necessarily offer a strict answer, but rather a framework that can help us think more carefully about the decisions and help churches think carefully about the decisions they're making and why.
Oh, don't worry. The internet will offer the strict descriptions and tell everybody.
I'm sure there is one right answer, and I just missed it. So yeah, but
it strikes me. I always run through my Rolodex of like what is Scripture doing with these kind of ideas, and Paul's and James's and Peter's insistence. Kind of on you are one spiritual body. You are many parts. They're always putting things in individuals in relation metaphors. Even as you're speaking, the vision of John in Revelation, where he is caught up in heaven, he sees the elders jointly attending to the Lamb on the throne. Right, like that is activity. I mean, I take that vision, but that this is actually what humans are created to do from Genesis to Revelation. Is they're always kind of focused together. I like my mind always runs to, I wonder if there is something very, I don't know how to say it, biologically humane about being in the room with other people. Like even like, this is going to sound really weird, but like the sharing of bacteria, we're always finding out there's more like shared ecosystem going on between human biomes than we ever expected, right? But that there probably is something, very pro-social and beneficial to the body, be in the rooms together, even though it can also bring together, COVID and all that.
It's an argument for the common cup to get rid of your...
It's
get rid of your shot glasses, you Presbyterians.
We're not any descriptions here, but we do know that just human touch, sitting together, and also reflecting together. I was just thinking this morning, and completely unrelated to preparing for this discussion, just how good it is when I was a young man to just have one time a week where I sat and just reflected in church. Like that was like, I went to church, I heard someone get my mind off myself, off my own trouble, and just maybe reflect on the wider world, myself, my position in the wider world. Which makes me think, Josh, that, man, if it's all about joint attention in some way, the joint experience, and then the attention we focus on, I imagine that lots of people are thinking, wow, my church often focuses me on my church's activities, my church, my pastor, and how great they are, and it seems like liturgy does have to be constrained prescriptively in some ways here into what we focus people on.
Yeah, I think that that recognition of liturgy being about jointly attending is a really helpful starting point. But I think, as we've kind of already acknowledged, it doesn't really tell us much about precisely what to do. But I think what it does is it helps us to ask the right questions. Because if we acknowledge that actually what we do when we gather is we attend together, and we attend in lots of different ways, but the aim is that we attend together, then I think we can start noticing a bit more about what it is that we're attending to and how we're attending to it. And I think it's even, I mean, as a preacher, you do kind of have to fight with yourself not to. I mean, like let's be honest. There's a wonderful adrenaline rush that you get when you have a congregation laughing at your jokes, right? Like it's very. We've all been there as preachers of wanting to make a sermon more about our own affirmation recognition than about anything else. But actually, if you shift your thinking of preaching to being an act of allowing people to attend together to God's presence and to God's word, then actually what you're doing as a preacher is you're directing attention in certain ways. And like you say, you can that can be hugely detrimental as well as hugely beneficial. If you've ever tried to drive a car with screaming children in the back, it's there are some kinds of attention sharing that can be really harmful. Like they can make you a bad driver because you can't fully attend because there are too many things demanding your attention. And so I think it isn't. I don't think what we're trying to offer is a kind of normative, this is how you ought to attend. But really we're saying liturgy is about attending, and actually reflecting on that can open up lots of helpful questions about what we're doing when we gather and how we do it. So I don't think we give all that many answers in the book. It's not really what we're trying to do. It's not a how-to guide, but I hope that it gets people to ask the right kind of questions.
And that will come up in the critiques as well. They never told us what to do. This is every book on ritual. They never told us what to do. I'm like, well, yeah.
That's kind of the point, right?
Yeah. It also seems to me you hand pastors and deacons and elders kind of a toolkit, because you all know that if you're pastoring a church or working in any kind of institution, people constantly are coming to you with, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, right? And you can say, okay, well, does that help us to jointly attend? Does that, or is that distract us in some way? It gives you another way to slice and dice what you're doing as a congregation.
Yeah.
Before we leave, I do want you to offer, you wrote a little article for us and it shows, and you wrote a more extensive treatment on it in the book, but I do want to hear why on the continuum, this is more theoretical. We have this kind of, we're just thinkers, right? We just need to think correctly, all the way over to we are these fully embodied creatures. And you take on Jamie Smith's work a little bit there. He said, hey, it's good, but it's not good enough. What is not quite good enough about his work on desire, the humans being creatures of desire, and then the kind of embodiment that he out there? Because there's a lot of very good stuff in his work, I think.
Yeah, Gideon, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess from the sort of psychological angle, I appreciate that. That's maybe something that distinguishes what we're doing from his work, but I think generally the idea of placing some aspect of the human person as primary or fundamental always is going to run into some kind of issues, because you kind of then have to explain everything starting from there. And I think we try and put forward a framework where we see these things as sort of part of an interconnected whole. So, whenever you're talking about cognition and affect, for example, they're always sort of intertangled with each other. I don't think you can really talk about cognitive processes without talking also about affective processes. And you can't really talk about either of those without talking about the activity of the body. Of course, you can talk about them in one sense in terms of, as psychologists, we sort of chunk out particular topics for the focus of our study. But when we try and put it all back together, they're part of the interconnected whole. And so I think that's something that we really try and say, well, there's this sort of interconnected aspect. And then when we also look beyond the focus on an individual and look at the role of interconnectedness between persons as well, and how sort of jointness and sharedness seems to play a really fundamental role in our view of human anthropology, then I think those aspects are perhaps what's sort of distinctive about our account. And possibly, we slip into ways of talking that maybe prioritize sort of affect first or a body first approach at points. Quite possibly, it's quite hard to sort of sustain that real idea that these things are sort of working together. And there's a sort of developmental angle as well in terms of trying to understand, the cognitive processes of a human adult are different to those of an infant, and we have to sort of look at this sort of way that they change over time, and this idea of change over time, and not trying to think that these are just stable things that you can just grasp onto and say, this is what human cognition is like, when it's a process that is one of development. And throughout the lifespan, it doesn't sort of just stop in adulthood as well. So this sort of developmental view, this sort of social shared view, and then this sort of interconnected view, I think those are the sort of parts that we try to really emphasize within the book.
Yeah, I think, if what the church needed was a really healthy view of embodiment and what that means. There's a whole movement of that in the 90s and 2000s, and this to me represents the next phase of, okay, now that we all acknowledge embodiment matters in very profound ways, now what do we do with it? So I'm very grateful to your work. The book is called Why We Gather. It's from Baylor University Press. I don't remember the subtitle, but I never do. Thank you, Josh and Gideon.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.